Hello, I'm Andrew Susskind, and I'm a psychotherapist and author based on the west side of Los Angeles since 1992, specializing in trauma and addictive compulsive behaviors. Welcome to my podcast, named after my recent book and workbook, It's Not About the Sex. Here we have direct and honest conversations related to compulsive sexual behavior and trauma, all from a sexual health perspective. Our intention is to offer fresh viewpoints and practical strategies toward establishing greater intimacy and a more deeply connected life. Let's begin. Stefanie Klein is a licensed clinical social worker, neuroaffective relational model master therapist, consultant, and somatic experiencing practitioner. She is also a trainer and consultant for the Complex Trauma Training Center. Stefanie has spent more than 28 years in her Los Angeles private practice, specializing in treating adults impacted by complex trauma. Stefanie can be reached by her website at complextraumatrainingcenter.com. I am so thrilled to have my colleague and close friend, Stefanie Klein, here on today's podcast. And she's going to be talking with us about shame, but shame through the lens of NARM. And she's going to let us know right now what NARM means to her.
Well, first of all, I have to say thank you for having me, Andrew. And it's just so fun to be with you and connect after our long history. And thank you for having me on to talk about one of my favorite topics, toxic shame, and how we look at it through the NARM perspective. I just want to start by saying that NARM is an acronym. It stands for the Neuroaffective Relational Model, which is an approach to psychotherapy that was designed specifically to address the symptoms and the impacts of developmental and complex trauma. So you don't have to worry too much about what each of those words mean, but it's a model that brings both psychodynamic theory and somatic psychology together to support people in healing from relational wounding.
And so when you talk about developmental and complex trauma, can you say a little bit more about what that really means and how people would be able to identify if that's something that they're personally dealing with?
I tend to believe that pretty much everybody is impacted by relational trauma because we're raised by human beings and human beings are imperfect and human. And so I think none of us get all of our needs perfectly met when we're young. And there's, of course, wide range of degrees of how people are impacted by early trauma. Developmental trauma officially would refer to how we're impacted by attachment trauma and trauma in our early development, our needs not being adequately met, our core psychobiological needs not being adequately met when we're between the ages of 0 and 18. Complex trauma is a term that's kind of still being defined in many ways. Well, the way we hold it in NARM is it's a grouping of kind of some major categories of trauma: attachment trauma, developmental trauma, intergenerational trauma, cultural trauma, these different kind of overlapping categories of trauma that aren't like what we think of when we're talking about PTSD, where we think of like an event that happens. We got in a car accident or we were assaulted, but that it's more speaking to chronic misattunement, abuse, neglect, things that were part of our everyday life and that were sort of like the air we breathed growing up, and that we had to then sort of adapt to in all sorts of different ways to survive our early environments. And the other thing I just want to say is that complex trauma can also happen in adulthood in situations where somebody really loses all control or say over their own lives. So like if you were a political prisoner, for instance. So complex trauma is something that can arise later in life.
Would that also apply to religious trauma as well?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, anything that really gets in the way impacts the healthy development of the self or takes away somebody's capacity to be in charge of themselves in a significant way. And religious trauma, cults, those things can definitely bring the symptoms of complex trauma
Mhm.
later in life.
One thing I heard you say is that there's something about the relationship with self and others that we're really focusing on today when we're talking about shame, which we'll get to in a moment. But one of the words that always comes to me is the idea of rupture,
Mm-hmm.
that like you said, parents or caregivers, they do their best, but there's always gaps between what we hope would be available and what actually is available, which we could
Yes.
call a rupture. Are we in the right ballpark with that?
We are so in the right ballpark. In fact, I mean, misattunement, rupture, all of these things are actually a necessary part of healthy development in childhood. Like rupture is a really cool thing to talk about because when you look at it developmentally, when a parent is gazing at their child, they can't do that 24 hours a day. The infant is embraced in this perfect gaze, but mom or dad has to go to the bathroom, they have to do something, they have to break it, and there's a rupture there. The child doesn't like it, they want the parent back, and they get to protest and cry, and then the parent comes back and they get to start developing an early sense of agency, that like they have impact, that they can make something happen. So rupture is not only a normal part of development, it's also necessary for healthy development.
Sure. I love that because sometimes I think there's an overemphasis on what went wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And I hear what you're saying is that there's agency, there's repair, or at least the possibility of repair. And so as a result, there's that experience of healing that can happen. Not all the time, but can happen.
Exactly. There's no such thing as perfect attunement. And when parents, I want to talk to all the parents who are listening out there. I'm a parent. When we start talking about developmental trauma and shame and early trauma, we can be really hard on ourselves as parents. And we can
Yeah.
start feeling like, oh God, I did this wrong. I did that wrong. Like healthy development is just about it being good enough. It's not
Mhm.
about it being perfect. And it
Right.
never is.
Sure. So shifting specifically to shame, one of the things that I think happens with shame is it often gets a bad rap. Like oftentimes people will call it a negative emotion or
Yeah.
they'll call it toxic shame. Is all shame toxic and negative?
Well, no, and I think you talk about this in your workbook and your book. So, but by the way, congratulations on both of those things.
Thank you.
They're amazing. And
Mm,
there's lots of different words for healthy shame. I think some people use it interchangeably with guilt or healthy guilt, versus toxic shame, or you use the term in your workbook, carried shame. Shame is an experience that it can is important in society, it's important in child rearing, it's related to authentic empathy. It's where we feel a yucky feeling inside because we crossed a boundary or we did something that caused somebody hurt, and then we have this icky feeling that we could call healthy shame, and that tells us that we need to make some kind of repair, if we can connect to that feeling. So I think that healthy shame is an important part of society. It helps us know where the boundaries are. What we're talking about today more is going to be toxic shame, or I think you refer to it
mhm,
as carried shame. And again,
mhm,
the terms don't really matter.
mhm,
It's really just, trying to understand the ins and outs of this really important human life theme.
mhm. Right. So it's more about how shame lives inside of us, because we all have it, of course,
Yeah.
and how in recovery it often gets entrenched and how to work with that. And I love what NARM has to offer because I hear you really talking about how it can be a necessary and reparative kind of experience.
Yeah, we really look at where shame originates. Like, in order to work with shame effectively and work through shame, we kind of have to understand like what it's for. Where does it originate? And we do have a particular way of looking at it, which doesn't have to conflict with any of the other ways of looking at it. It's just
Hmm.
another angle to bring in. So, like, we look at shame not so much as an emotion, but as a process or a mechanism. So we look at it as a verb more than a noun in NARM. So we see it as a process of shutting ourselves down as a process of ensuring our survival. Which is it's interesting. It's interesting to think about the necessity of shame, of it being a brilliant adaptive strategy to surviving
Mhm.
adverse childhood experiences.
Mhm.
The problem is that when we have to day in and day out use this mechanism of shame in order to manage whatever is failing in our environment, then
Mhm.
we also start to build an identity around shame. And we
Mhm.
start to really internalize shame. And then it becomes this operating system that we carry forward with us into our adult lives. And it drives a lot of suffering and a lot of symptoms and behaviors that are, it's no longer adaptively useful for us.
Mhm. What's so enlightening to me is the idea of it being a process rather than an
Yeah.
emotion. And I think it's probably the first time anyone on the podcast has said that. So congratulations,
Ooh,
Stephanie
fun.
Klein. That's right. Woo! And and but what I want to say about that is it really humanizes it and normalizes it. And also I hear how the survival strategy that goes along with it is also necessary.
It really is necessary. And Dr. Lawrence Heller, who created NARM, really, in my opinion, has a brilliant way of looking and working with shame that I've found in working with my clients has been super helpful. And in just working with myself, and being a
Mhm.
client myself has been super
Mhm.
helpful. And really, I could boil it all down to this very simple phrase,
Mhm.
which is, if I feel bad, I am bad. So, this is the experience for us in childhood when we're dependent on an environment that is not meeting our core psychobiological needs consistently.
Mhm. Mhm.
We feel bad, scary feelings inside because our needs aren't being met. And it's so important that we are able to, as dependent, tiny, tiny people, believe and hope that we're going to be okay, that we're going to survive.
Mhm.
So we have to see our environments or our parents as capable of loving us. So what we do really adaptively is we internalize whatever's failing. And we take it in, we make it about ourselves. This is an unconscious process for young children. We don't like think about it. We
Mhm.
just do it because we're
Right.
brilliant survivors.
Sure.
And so we internalize it. If my needs aren't being met, there must be something wrong with my needs. And if there's something wrong with my needs, I can't stop having them, so there must be something wrong with me. And we start to identify ourselves as bad and faulty and unlovable and unworthy and disgusting and all of these really, really difficult ways, but we're doing it in order to preserve the hope of love in the universe. If we
Mhm.
didn't do that, if we didn't start to organize around shame and personalize these failures, what we'd be left with is, my environment can't take care of me. I'm not going to be okay. And that's just intolerable for us when we're very, very young.
Mhm. Mhm.
We just can't. So it's really more adaptive to see ourselves as an unlovable child with loving parents than to see ourselves as lovable and okay with an environment or parents that aren't able to sufficiently love us.
Mhm.
It gives us something we can do. It gives us, we can try to be better. We can
Mhm.
work harder, and
Mhm.
it also helps shut down anything that's authentic, alive, true, real inside of us that might threaten our attachment.
Mhm.
When we're growing up in really chaotic environments or violent environments, if we are angry or if we cry, we've all heard the phrase, I'll give you something to cry about.
Mhm.
Like, it can be dangerous. So, toxic shame is a very effective mechanism for disconnecting us and shutting down what's most authentic inside of us so that we can make it.
Mhm. Right. So it actually helps us navigate those dangerous or chaotic family situations.
It really does. But there's a high price we pay
Yeah.
because we start to over time, as we're organizing our way of being and our relationship to the world through the lens of I'm bad, it's me, in order to protect the image of our family or our
Hmm.
parents, our environment is good. Over time, you know, we start to mistake that for who we really are, and then we develop what you know what originally was this brilliant adaptive strategy becomes an active process of self-shaming that we bring into our adult lives and continue to engage like in life through. So people walk into therapy and people walk around in life relating to themselves and the world around them through self-hatred, self-attack, self-judgment, self-criticism,
Hmm. Hmm.
self-shame, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously. And that's what we then as therapists get to work with and help people, and support them in understanding and coming out the other end and potentially having a relationship with themselves that's more rooted in self-compassion and self-acceptance.
Hmm. Wow.
And again, you talk about that too. You talk, you know, in your workbook, these different ways that we can start to relate to ourselves through self-compassion.
Sure. What I'm wondering is, and I just want to highlight this because I think it's so important, is that we're talking about what you're calling an adaptive process.
Mm-hmm.
So the child adapts to the environment as best he, she, they know how to do.
Mm-hmm.
But then that pattern or that identity follows them into adulthood. And like you said, that's when in a sense, the suffering deepens,
Yes.
right? And so say more about how how does that work or not, the idea of the adaptive process in
Mm-hmm.
our adult lives.
Well, it doesn't work great for us. And I do think it's the primary driver, from an arm perspective, it's the primary driver of so many of the symptoms and behaviors that people are wanting to stop, but it's so hard to stop. And, you know, you might find as a therapist, I find as a therapist that you can't just talk somebody out of feeling bad about themselves. Like you can't even just give them evidence. Like, you know, this is what we're holding in NARM is that it's deeply rooted in every kind of cell of our being. It's deeply embedded in our wiring, and so it's not so easy to shift. But how when you say how it works, we continue to actively in the here and now, moment to moment, relate to ourselves in particular ways. And so by looking at shame as a verb, what we are likely to start to bring into therapy in NARM is that when somebody starts to say that they're feeling shame, we can get curious about what happened right before they started to feel shame. Because what were they connecting to? What were they noticing? What happened right before? And then going the next step, they began to shame themselves. So I'm using this verb language, which, you know,
Hmm.
again, people who are in NARM therapy can kind of get used to. We make verbs out of a lot of things
Hmm.
because it's an agency perspective. It's not about blame. It's not about blaming ourselves. Well, you're doing it, so just stop doing it.
Right.
It's about recognizing that we're actively relating to ourselves moment to moment in some particular ways that are contributing to our suffering. And when people start to see that, oh, like I was feeling really angry and then I started to shame myself, or I was feeling really sad and then I started to shame myself, then we're starting to bring into some cohesion to some of the fragmentation and disconnection that was necessary to survive childhood trauma. Did that make
So
sense?
no, I love it
Okay,
because
okay.
I'm hearing how you're incrementally slowing the client down.
Mhm.
And all of us can relate to this, where we just fly through life doing,
Right.
doing, doing. But in the session, and I'd like to hear more about this, it sounds like there's that opportunity for the client to observe themselves a
Yes.
little bit differently, a little bit slower, and to give themselves that chance to ask themselves what's really happening inside, right?
Right.
Is so
Right.
say more about how that might take shape. Like if you were in session
Hmm.
with someone and
Hmm.
they were saying, "Oh, I'm feeling shame right now."
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, you might say, "What?"
Yeah, I might say, "Oh, well, so that's great. You're tracking, you're noticing. I'm inviting that observer, that adult consciousness, and you're noticing shame. Like, do you have a sense of what you're feeling shame around? I might start a little gentle. What you're feeling shame around. They might
Hmm.
help, say something. I'll
Hmm.
bring in more and more active language or more verb language, depending on the client's capacity, where they are in the moment to receive that in a helpful way. I don't want anybody to ever feel blamed, because that is not the intention. The intention is ultimately to feel our agency and to understand that we're actually actors in this, and that we're not just being attacked by shame. It's not descending out of the blue. It's a process that's happening that makes a lot of sense. And so I might say, I'm curious, like I just said, what was happening? Can we back up a second? What was happening right before? Or I might have noticed it myself and I might just observe. So you were talking about feeling really angry at your father, and then you started to notice this shame. So I'm already
Hmm.
kind of verbing a little. They started to
Right.
notice this shame. And how is it for me to make that connection? So I'm really working in the present moment,
Yeah.
with that. And who knows what will happen from there. Often they
Right.
start talking about that they feel bad, they feel guilty. My father, he was doing the best that he could, or whatever, you
Hmm.
know. But what we're really trying to unearth and support somebody to have more contact with is the primary emotion that's underneath the
Hmm.
shame. Like,
Hmm.
because like I look at shame as sort of like these bodyguards, these like cavalry of horses that rides in to be like, whoa, you're
Hmm.
getting really close to something that used to be very threatening to
Uh-huh.
your safety and well-being. It wasn't
Sure.
safe to be mad at my dad. So shame shuts that off.
Hmm.
And what we can then do is support somebody through, to have more emotional completion around their
Hmm.
anger. That was a normal reaction to circumstances that were not okay.
Hmm.
And support them to just build capacity to be with the anger, to relate to the anger without having to shut themselves down. And so
Hmm.
when shame shows up in a session, for me, it's on. Like we got to weigh in. We know something's
Hmm.
happening now.
Right.
We know that the client is getting close to something that is important, and that's why these mechanisms of self-shaming show up.
Hmm.
It can be really confusing, though, because the self-shaming, self-attack, self-sabotaging can show up the strongest sometimes when we're really moving forward, when we're
Hmm.
doing better. I'm sure,
Hmm.
in recovery, you see it all the time. Somebody's doing better. They're, things are feeling more organized. They've got, they put together days or whatever. They're feeling better about themselves. And that's when this self-shaming mechanism can kick in, because it
Right.
starts to feel threatening to leave behind the protective mechanism that saved
Hmm.
our lives.
Right. Right. Let me just reflect something because I want to make sure I understand how
Okay.
you might approach this. So if you're
Yeah.
with a client that you described, it sounds to me like there's a collaborative effort happening. It sounds like there's curiosity from you and inviting the client to be curious. There's also an implication of, I want to call it investigation,
Hmm.
non-judgmental investigation,
Yes. Yes.
right? And so
Yeah.
there's a lot of elements that I think are about relational attunement and
Yes.
maybe neurobiological attunement as well. And that's what I really want to understand because um, I know that NARM has a big component of the somatic um, awareness
Hmm.
and how that is part of the healing, of course. Can you say something about how that might link in with what we're talking about in terms of moving the toxic shame through?
Yeah, I mean, we look at shame as a top-down, bottom-up model. So we're tracking and working with and processing whatever is coming up from the more lower regulatory parts of the brain, the felt senses, the nervous system, and at the same time, what's processing top down, our thoughts, our beliefs, our identifications, and then in the middle, our emotions. And so all of that is moving at the same time in opposite directions. And so we're inviting awareness about all of it,
Hmm.
because a lot of these patterns, these shame patterns, are wired in so early, they're
Hmm.
pre-verbal. We're not going to
Hmm.
even recognize them except
Hmm.
for sensations in our body, like a sense of dread or something. So sometimes people can't even name shame. They'll just be
Right.
like, I feel hot, or I feel nauseous, or so NARM is this very exploratory process that's rooted in something the client wants for themselves, an intention. And then we go through this very consensual exploration, that is really about, more than anything, what's happening in the present moment. We don't really focus too much on the content, the history, what happened, the
Hmm.
story. You're nodding, so I'm guessing you work the same way, and a lot of modalities work the same way. But
Hmm.
real working through happens in the present moment through an embodied experience.
Hmm.
And so when somebody is feeling an emotion, when they're feeling a sensation, when they're engaging in a process, that's happening right then and there. And that's like
Hmm.
lightning in a bottle. And so we'll slow it down and get curious. I would
Hmm.
say our biggest intervention is curiosity. And that curiosity is such a huge ingredient of healthy attachment that
Hmm.
was missing for most of us.
Right.
True curiosity about about someone's inner world,
Hmm.
not like, what did you do at school today?
Right.
Did you do your homework? But true
Right.
curiosity.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I love that because it sounds like it's reclaiming something that was squashed.
Yes. Exactly. That touches me to just think of it that way, reclaiming
Hmm.
something that was squashed, and we're
Hmm.
supporting that relationally. We are talking about relational wounding, and like you talk about the fact that shame happens in relationships, so it has to be healed in relationship. And it's very true. This is very hard. It's hard to heal relational wounding just through meditations or affirmations. There really needs to
Hmm.
be a process that's relational, where somebody is being with you, not doing to you or trying to get you somewhere, or trying to make something happen, but just being with you wherever you are in that journey. So when shame
Hmm.
shows up, we're not trying to get rid of it. It's not a bad thing.
Hmm.
It's just, oh, wow, like something's happening here. This is a signal, and we get
Hmm.
to really understand it more together.
Right. When you were talking about seeing shame in session and kind of getting excited as the therapist,
Yeah,
I was thinking it really is a gold mine, isn't it?
it is.
Yeah, it's a
It is.
beautiful thing when it shows up and we get to work with it in the moment.
It is. And it's a beautiful thing that it's become such a popular topic.
Hmm.
Brene Brown and everything that she's brought into the field of shame. It's a beautiful thing that people are writing books about it, and that language is being used in social media, on all different levels of sophistication. But the bottom line is it is a gold mine.
Yeah, for sure. So how do you view recovery or post-traumatic growth and healing?
Yeah. Um, from an arm perspective, we think about it through the lens of increasing psychobiological capacity, which sounds like a wordy thing to say. But
Right.
like, what all I'm talking about is that it's not just about getting back to where we were before we self sabotaged or acted out or messed something up. It's not just about restoring ourselves to some previous level of functioning. Like, the opportunity of healing and is moving towards having a relationship with ourselves that is entirely different, rooted in more self-compassion, more self-acceptance, more self-agency, meaning seeing ourselves as actors and not just reactors in life, which is very empowering to view yourself that way. And having more capacity to be with all aspects of ourselves and all aspects of experience, all emotions, the ones that are more fun to feel, more capacity for joy. Sometimes it's hard somatically and psychologically to expand, to let ourselves feel joy, right? So more capacity for joy, but also more capacity to be with our anger, our grief, intense states like hatred, without having to disconnect and shut ourselves down so intensely. The beautiful thing about shame and disconnection in general is that it'll always be there for us when we need it. And sometimes we're going to need it.
Right.
Like we're going to need to shut down. We're going to need to disconnect. We're going to need to take care of ourselves in those ways. But to be able to have more aliveness, more connection, more intimacy, without having to shut down and attack ourselves as a way of doing that. That's really how I view recovery and post-traumatic growth. How about you?
You're going to turn the tables, are you?
Yeah. You don't have to answer. But...
No. I mean, what I really think about as you were talking is how do we help our clients be fully themselves, right?
Beautiful.
And I'm thinking innately what we're brought onto this earth, hopefully intact, and how to have all of that, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's so simple and so so beautiful because we're born with these states of being are our birthright.
Right.
And we have to disconnect from them as well as our needs in order to make it. And so it's like a returning home.
I think we came up with a new book, Returning Home.
Okay, you want to write it together?
I would love that actually. To spend more time with you. Of course I would.
Or that could be the next podcast, the Returning Home
True.
podcast.
That's true. We're almost out of time, and I always like to ask if there were maybe one or two takeaways that you would like our listening audience to really hold on to. What would they be?
Well, if I feel bad, I am bad. There's this scene in Good Will Hunting, which is a movie that maybe a lot of your listeners are too young to remember, but I know you saw it. But you might want to like stream it. But Good Will Hunting is about a kid with complex trauma. And there's a scene with him and his therapist where Robin Williams, who plays his therapist, the kid's Matt Damon, says over and over and over again, it wasn't your fault. It wasn't your fault. And Matt Damon's like, I know. But he doesn't know because deep down inside, because of this mechanism of toxic shame, he internalized the failure and he feels like he deserved it. And as Robin Williams keeps saying it, eventually Matt Damon breaks down and really finally lets out all of the emotion that's holding this toxic shame. So I recommend that people see that and just hold on to the understanding that if I feel bad, I am bad is really the big lie that we all on some level walk around with.
Not only do I love that movie and recommend it to everyone, but there's something about finding one's truth, right? That big lie, it somehow becomes it becomes the predominant energy. And so what I hear in terms of the healing direction, it's really about finding one's birthright and one's truth that is part of being a human on this earth.
Yeah. And it's this question of who, if I wasn't identifying this way,
That's right.
Who am I underneath all of these layers of identifications and adaptations and strategies to make it? Who is that, Yeah.
Anything else before we wind down?
Just thank you for having me and thank you for doing the work that you're doing. It's so great to get to collaborate and connect. And yeah, thank you to all the listeners out there who are on your healing journeys.
Yeah, and I just want to say something that I didn't say before. Stefanie and I have known each other about 30 years, and we've been on our own healing journeys, and we've been um, working in parallel ways for a long, long time. And I just respect you so deeply and am so, so pleased that we could share the time in this little way, in this moment together, this here and now moment.
Mm-hmm.
And I certainly look forward to crossing paths as always.
Thanks. Me too. I respect you so much, and it's just so good to know that you're out there. And even if we only see each other every once in a while, it's always magic for me.
Same.
Thanks,
Take good
Andrew.
care, Stefanie.
All
All
right.
right.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks for listening today. It was so terrific sharing the time with my colleague and my friend, Stefanie Klein, and discussing this really meaningful topic. She can be reached through her website at www.complextraumatrainingcenter.com. If you're so inclined, please give us a 5-star rating and be sure to subscribe and share my podcast with those who may benefit. I look forward to you joining us the next time, and don't forget to stay connected.